Morning. It is July 1. I forgot to send the announcement this week because I was busy doing the other recording, and whatever the excuse, it didn't go out. And as a result, the group is a little smaller than normal, but Gabe and Anthony are here. And Anthony, I engaged a little bit about this idea of self, as Gabe and I did earlier with Laura, with Laura in a walk that we do on Sunday mornings. And looking at the self we think we are is to simply look at an illusion, a narrative we create in thinking that is always changing. And to think that self is real and true has us take seriously what's effectively a joke. And it's not a joke until we take it seriously. So the immediacy of the consequence of our actions becomes pretty imperative or pretty apparent when we immediately think there's an imperative to fix the thing that is broken by the thinking we're doing about it that has no basis. So if who I think I am is only what I think, all of a sudden I think I have a person that seems to be separate from me because I talk to it and have conversations about it with it and seem to have directives of what I think it should be doing and what it didn't do and what I should be doing as a result of what it doesn't want to do, and all this internal grind and struggle that seems so impossible to overcome. And it isn't impossible to overcome. I just insist on continuing to maintain it and make believe this illusion, this idea, this imagined concept of who I think I am, simply because I'm thinking of thinking itself. I think I become that self of thought. Not true. It's just an imagined state. So if I'm taking it seriously, again, I take things personally and they are not funny. And I think who I am is all I think. And I am very prone to react to the way other people think about me because I'm all based on appearance. It's all based on illusion. It's all based on a superficial projection of thought. And all my thoughts come with images, and I suspect yours do too, if you think about it. They tend to begin to imagine things associated to real things that we see in the world and associate them to this imaginary state we create in our own thoughts. And my experience is it's largely what we think about and wonder why we don't seem to be very productive in life, or seem to be lacking in value, or seem to be lacking in virtue, or seem to be lacking in a ethical, moral state that is unquestionable and absolute in nature. Largely because, if not exclusively, who I think I am is what I think. So I'm constantly dealing in a state of flux, thinking my fixation on it is going to settle it, while it's the fixation on it that continues to break it. And the immediacy of the breaking of it and the fixation has no gap between the time. It just often, if I can postpone and deny things and make believe they're not happening until they're so hard to deny that it's impossible to deny them, then that whole time in between, I've been acting as though they aren't happening simply because they aren't as bad as they can possibly get. And that's trying to use subtlety against my own sentient awareness that something is happening that's wrong. We've talked before about people having these incredible experiences that are referred to as near-death experiences. And the question I pose is, why do we need to wait till we're near death to begin to witness the absolute totality of a loving, absolute, welcoming, embracing source if we didn't think we were protecting a life by defending thoughts and ideas that aren't true obsessively to make believe we needed to fix the thing that doesn't even exist, the insane idea that illusions become reality, preoccupy me with a fear of death, when in fact what I'm really afraid of is no longer thinking about the self I am, because that self I think I am is made up of thought, simply thinking of itself. So thought thinking of itself does not produce me or any person or any being or any essence. It just produces thoughts, more thoughts, more thoughts, more thoughts, more thoughts. The more thinking I do, the more thoughts I have. Obsessive thinking is the idea that if I can think only about the self I think I am, it will be real because I won't be thinking about anything else. And an obsession is effectively thinking about nothing else. meaning I've gone blind to everything else. I don't want to think about it beyond the scope of my obsessive thinking because all I'm thinking about has a life that's dependent on that thinking. It isn't a life. It's simply an imagined self. That's it. Now, I can imagine myself to be anything I want, and there's freedom in that when I'm doing that. But when I begin to imagine that who I am is what I think, I begin to feel condemned and spite and disconnected and immoral and unethical and fraudulent and an imposter, because I'm actually promoting ideas that are fraudulent and have no basis, as though they're true. Those are called lies, typically. And lies do not need to be thought of as lies to be utilized as lies and to create the consequences of lies. Doesn't need to happen. If we feel the effects, which are disturbing, conflicted, emotional turmoil, anxiety, stress, depression, all those consequences are reflections or effects of thinking that is opposed to reality and truth, trying to pretend it is reality and truth. So if I pretend my thoughts are real and true, I'm obviously pretending that reality and truth don't exist, because I'm thinking that my thinking is an exception to them. If they are infinite in any way, which would be in every way, I have to discount them entirely to make believe what I'm thinking is in fact reality and truth. That's a big leap, and one that has never been made, but one that has effectively undermined our ability as humans to express our functional capacity as a result of dysfunctionally thinking. So we dysfunction as a result of this broken thinking, this idea that somehow or another we are only what we think. So Gabe and I and Laura earlier today had a conversation about the fact that this is effectively a joke that we take seriously. And it's very often heard not to take ourselves too seriously. Why would we be told not to take something seriously if we didn't know it wasn't serious? And to not take things personally. Why would we be told not to take them personally if the thing we thought was our person was in fact our person? We would obviously take them personally because we would be interacting with them on a personal basis. But if this persona that we've created, all imagined and make believe is true, is what we're being asked not to take seriously or not to take personally, think about it. We're actually being told there is nothing there to take. There is no persona and there is no self. There is no reality in it. It's illusion. It's complete illusion. And this fantasy as reality has been primary to thinking, as far as I can tell, maybe not through all of human history, because there was a time when people were just worried about being eaten and what to eat. And I don't expect they had a lot of anxious disorders or neurosis during that time because they were just busy struggling to do what they could to survive. And we, in our affluence and in the things we've created to give us a greater sense of ease, have replaced that ease with a sense of anxiety and stress and depression that is killing people in an all-time records today, suicide, and addiction. Addiction is suicide because nothing we do compulsively is ever healthy for us. It is always undermining our body in some way because it is a replication of the thinking we're doing that is causing stress and anxiety and depression in our own systems, undermining all of our bodily systems, putting them all at risk in terms of our physical health, while we might even think we're not doing it. So we don't need to think we're doing something to be doing the thing we're doing. And we don't need to think we know to know. So thinking is not critical to knowing. Thinking is critical to thinking. And if we're misusing it, we're really not availing thinking of its point and purpose, useful purpose, and instinctual purpose. We are actually turning it against our experience in the name of trying to kill something that doesn't even exist. So we think we're afraid of death. My contention is we are afraid of living. There is an automatic nature that our bodies will disintegrate, and I don't think there's anything to fear about that because it's absolutely guaranteed. They used to say death and taxes were guaranteed. Apparently, taxes are not guaranteed. But this death, which may not even be a death, it may just be a transformation, a disintegration of an integrated collection of molecules that turn back into their essence when the body no longer has purpose or use. Doesn't mean we die. If our essence isn't essential, it isn't something that comes and goes. It isn't something that we have more or less of. It isn't something that we can let go of or that we can ever be a part of or apart from, though we can think we are. So it starts to isolate thinking as something we're doing rather than something we are. And the idea that we can't stop doing the thing we're thinking starts to become a little less likely to think, because thinking starts to be seen as simply something we do rather than, again, something we are. The permanence of reality and truth is built into the obsessive nature of thinking about thinking, because thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking is what maintains that idea we have that is defensive and reactive and impulsive and compulsive, or leads to those things, that who we are is what we think. It's not true. Truth is true, and reality is reality. And they do not need to be thought of to be as they are. So, Gabe, I forget the exact points we covered today, but I think we're going to start to formalize them a little bit and write them down, just have talking points on this. But I think the idea of a joke being taken seriously when it's personal is exactly the concept that happens when we think who we are is what we think, and all of a sudden take personally anything that is contrary to what we think. Anyone else is thinking or anyone else is doing that doesn't line up with what we think all of a sudden becomes offensive. Why? Because we're defending this idea that would have no need for defense if it was actually true and real, because reality and truth does not fight for itself, because it doesn't have any risk of disappearing and expiring. Doesn't have an expiration date. It's always ever present. It's always the nature of nature. It's always the present state of our being, awareness, always now, always now, always now. For humans, it isn't now for a spirit, because that spirit and that essence isn't in space and time. Doesn't think about space and time. It's a knowing of knowing and an awareness of awareness that is the nature of our existence too. It's not just somewhere else, something to achieve. It's something that has us, that doesn't let go because it doesn't hang on. It has no risk. It doesn't have to grasp anything because it doesn't have any limitations. It doesn't have to wonder because it doesn't have any limitation. It doesn't have to think because it doesn't have any lack of knowing.
If you're in that defense, you're not going to see these concepts.
Well, until you start seeing the defense as a defense that's only important, because my experience is now I see the defenses and say, oh, I'm defending something that isn't true. Very, very seldom have I ever been attacked in a way that I really need to defend myself, right? So most of the defenses are just an internal grind of trying to maintain this reactive, impulsive, compulsive behavior to give myself something to distract myself and think the problem's outside of me, because it's that interactive stuff I'm doing compulsively and impulsively that causes, and reactively, that causes these interreactivity with people, places, and things. So I sort of create a mess to constantly keep myself distracted with what I think is the problem, rather than notice the problem is the thinking that I'm doing and the utilization, the misutilization of the thinking. It isn't even thinking's fine. It's how I misutilize it, like we talked about earlier. It's like a car that isn't tuned properly backfires. And you hear those big explosions and pops, and it's an indication that something is misfiring. And this is literally a misfiring of our own mechanical thinking nature. It has a system that is designed to function on a certain basis and designed perfectly to dysfunction on another basis.
Yeah. For me too, Jack, the conversation we had this morning of the conversation, the internal conversation, the two selves idea, that's something I haven't heard you talk about, and it's something I haven't thought deeply about, but is, absolutely true for me, the self conversation.
So one of the original bridges for you was noticing your thoughts aren't real. Just literally. Is that what it was?
Just like you said, consider.
Yeah.
That your thoughts may not be true. Just consider. And so right. I had never considered it.
Well, and what's interesting too about considering is that if you're considering something that's real, your consideration will confirm it. But if you're absolutely positive something's real, any conflict will confirm it's not. Because reality and truth has no fight in it, because it has no doubt in it, because it isn't at risk, and it isn't something that comes and goes. It's a totality that cannot be challenged, that cannot be reduced, that cannot be increased. It can't be gotten, and it can't be lost. It can't be found because it can't be lost. So it's an essence that is words will never explain. And if each of us didn't know it, we wouldn't have any reference to it to even begin to relate to in our human experience. But my experience is everyone knows it. We've just been preoccupied denying it to maintain the desperate thoughts we have about who we think we are, so that we're living in this sort of superficial haze of preoccupation, which means we're paying attention to things that aren't happening, which is insanity, literally. If we're having a conversation with a self, for instance, like we talked about earlier, that's literally hearing things and seeing things that aren't happening. That's a good definition of insanity. And to think the job is to fix insanity by getting it right is what obsessive thinking tries to do. Constantly think more, think harder, think better, think worse, whatever it is. Not think this, do that. All that stuff, Anthony, that you're often talking about. They're all just new ways of thinking. Thinking's going to solve it, while the thinking we're using is actually fixated on creating the problem and maintaining the problem. And the insanity is thinking someday it will become true. So the insanity starts with my thinking I'm going to fix what's wrong and make it right. I'm going to fix what's false and make it true. I'm going to fix what doesn't exist and make it real. And it happens in the immediacy of now, always for our human experience. It doesn't happen at all in reality. It happens only in our thinking, in our brain, in our.
But then I take it you don't believe in manifesting at all, because that's a lot of people say, oh, I manifest. I just really think about what my goals are, and I visualize where I should be. You don't believe that at all, right?
No, I believe it absolutely. We manifest anxiety, we manifest stress, we manifest depression, we manifest reactiveness, we manifest defenses, we manifest all of the components of something that seems to be at risk. All of them, the anxiety, the emotional disorder, the turmoil, the anxiety disorders, all of that is a manifestation of this insanity parading as reality. And it doesn't take much. And, Gabe, you made that point earlier today. It's so subtle at times. And yet we have tried to become numb to what's so obvious that the subtlety starts to become seemingly lost. Katie just brought me some yogurt and flaxseed and blueberries. It seems to be lost on us because we have become unwilling to notice the subtlety of the discontent and the disturbance and the discomfort that we create until it becomes so bad that we can't deny it any longer, that the problem becomes so severe that we finally begin to say something's wrong. So to live that way means most of our experience is being spent defending and defying and denying reality and truth. And that's delusional to make believe it could possibly ever work and ever solve the problem, when it's actually creating the problem as we go, with every breath, every step, every choice, regardless of how we're thinking about it. If we look at the effects, we'll start seeing clearly something is wrong. I'm anxious. I'm disturbed. I'm reactive. I'm becoming impulsive. I can't seem to keep myself from saying the things that antagonize somebody else or inflame a situation. And I start doing things. Could be food, could be smoking, could be drugs and alcohol, could be gambling, it could be more risky sex, it could be all kind of getting into relationships that aren't working or workable. And it's all based on this internal dialogue that I actually think I'm having a relationship with a self I've created that seems to be independent of my actual experience. And even that alone admits I'm aware that I have an independent experience that has nothing to do with the self I'm thinking about. Yeah, what do I think? All I can do.
But that one talks to the other is sort of like sort of self what's the word? I don't know.
Serving.
Yeah, like you're
But really it's thought serving. It's thought serving itself to the idea, and this isn't thought acting independently. So for me to say it in that way and give anyone the impression that this is thought doing it to us, it's us deciding to misutilize thought by having it think of itself and make believe the self it thinks of happens to be who we are. Think of the independence of that self we create in the imagination that it's real. That now, if it's real, would be able to act against us and act in ways that embarrass us and act in ways that disturb us, all in an effort to make believe it isn't us choosing it. We're trying to divest our absolute responsibility for creating it by thinking of it as something independent of us. So we say, intrusive thoughts are controlling me. Obsessive thoughts are controlling me. Ego is attacking me. My brain is attacking me. These things can't attack us. They have no life of their own. They are at our volition. Our bodies are at our disposal, literally. We get to choose, each of us. And I think that was the other point today, Gabe, that we touched on, is that I can't tell anybody about their experience any better than they are aware of it and controlling it. I can't tell somebody to stop doing something. I can. No, I certainly can. But it won't have any effect and impact until any of us or each of us actually comes to terms with what we're doing, independent of everyone else. When I think it's anything or anyone else, I am doing what I can to divest myself of the extraordinary impact I have on my own experience that is greater than anyone else can cause, because the immediacy of my experience is occurring in the same place it's being created, in my brain, and affecting my entire body immediately. And it's also exactly where my pain and pleasure zones are. It's as close to the pain and pleasure zones and as close to my experience as anyone else can ever possibly get, unless I'm having my skull opened up by a surgeon and he's poking around in my brain. And even then, that's a very minor experience of someone getting close to the thing I'm absolutely close to in all respects of my human capacity. I couldn't have enough needles and I couldn't have enough wires and I couldn't have enough things connected to me to be greater than the absolute integrated connections I'm already witnessing, experiencing, and have as a human. So this conversation isn't telling anybody anything. It's simply suggesting that there are ways to utilize what we do in ways that are much more productive and useful and actually helpful. And if we have any faith in our absolute nature, then relying on that takes very little faith, because it doesn't need proof to confirm, when we're relying on it, that the results are profoundly different and beyond the limits of the imagination we've had, that we'll eventually get it sometime somewhere else with someone else and more or less of something else that never comes true. Never comes true because it's based in what's false. I can't get it somewhere else if I don't have it here, if I don't have it now. Now, if I say that, nobody has to believe it. But if you try it on, wear it for a minute, a day, a week, and live with it as a consideration, you'll start noticing that a lot of the unnatural things you used to think were constantly happening to you will start to dissipate. And often it takes months to even notice you're not doing it, because it's so natural not to be doing them and so unnatural to be doing them. That time passes, it doesn't stand still anymore, because things don't take forever, because they're immediately resolving. in the firing of the synapses and all the stuff that's going on in our body, as we begin to realize and think along actual lines of reality and truth, it just begins to naturally align us because we've always been aligned while we've been delusionally preoccupied with an idea that we weren't. I think your other point, Gabe, this morning about this not even being an addiction, we talk about it as an addiction because we think of it as something independent than us. It's basically just a misapplication in the present of reapplying dysfunctional ideas and getting the same dysfunctional result, thinking someday we'll get it better. Someday feeling better about it actually helps it get worse because we're cementing the idea there's nothing we can do about the cause, and all we can do is try to treat the effect. And that really is what eventually and immediately is seen as addiction. This idea someday we'll get it right if we do more of the thing that's wrong.
Yeah, that's hard to sort of grasp, I think, from a normal layperson standpoint.
How about you?
No, I can grasp it, but I couldn't have grasped it first 30 days of sobriety or something. You can't.
But what if it's always had you and you've always known it and you simply have been delusionally preoccupied with obsessive thinking as though it's real and true, which is insanity. Literally, it's insanity. It doesn't have to have us completely immobilized and incapacitated to not be able to mind any of our own business. And what's interesting about that point, if I said that clearly enough, is that while we're preoccupied with insane ideas, most of us have been functioning pretty well, which shows that we're really designed to function and be productive, that we can even be entertaining delusional ideas on a daily basis, creating anxiety, stress, depression, and all the byproducts, all the mental illnesses that come with it, and still get by, still seem to make out of it. It certainly speaks to an abundant world rather than one that's as scarce as we think it is, with the scarce thoughts we're thinking from.
Your point on the homeless was well taken there. On these people are surviving
Against all odds.
Against all odds.
And they're written off as people that need nothing more than or less than being fully taken care of by society with getting new condos. There are people in Los Angeles living in neighborhoods that are much more affordable than some of the other neighborhoods. And the outcry is to build the housing in some of the most expensive neighborhoods because everyone deserves the equal right to live wherever they want. Well, what about the people who are paying rent in those other neighborhoods that are working and productive? Should they also now give up their job and live on the street so they can get better off? It caters to this demented idea that people have no capacity, that they're completely helpless without other people's big ideas coming to the rescue. That's effectively enabling and effectively, in my experience, the core disease of addiction. If a parent gives a drug addict child cash, what do you think's going to happen? Think it's a surprise if they overdose? And an overdose doesn't have to kill somebody to be overdosing in a way that's immobilizing them to be able to perform and function in any productive manner. The mental illness is not with the people on the street. They seem to actually be managing, despite all odds. It's with the people presuming they have no better chance than living there another 7 or 8 years and getting worse and proving how able they are till billions of dollars can be spent to give them a place to live. It's dysfunctional. And it's also fiscally irresponsible. It will not last. It can't last. It can't work. It's going to break the bank. You can't disqualify people from being productive and serve more and more people that want to fall under that umbrella simply because they'd like to use drugs and alcohol, or they have some other mental disability that isn't being addressed. If we don't address and diagnose a problem correctly, the misdiagnosis in any licensed practitioner would have his license taken away and be arrested for abuse of humanity. And we're doing it publicly. If the doctor gave drugs for a disease that somebody didn't have, and that disease kept getting worse, and they died, he could potentially be held responsible for homicide, or at least manslaughter. No, you don't see any politicians being arrested for that. We have people dying weekly on the streets as a result of these thoughts. They're just thoughts. And I suppose there's nothing wrong with it to the extent that we seem to be doing it proactively and willingly and allowing it to continue. While we may have objections, we may not like it. However, we don't like it and object to it as not having any kind of influence sufficient enough to resolve the problem. So I would say, again, it falls back on this concept that we don't speak very well to issues happening in ways that are honest enough to have people stop for a second and say, wow, that could make a difference in a way that actually help people rather than make a difference in a way that hurts people. We're always making a difference. We're always having an impact. We're always changing the ideas. But when things get worse, it's an indication that we have misdiagnosed the problem and are treating it in ways that are making it worse. And it is getting worse. The numbers are growing according to the last survey, which I also think is completely stacked because the people that do those surveys are dependent on making it look as though they're actually helping, while they're also trying to look as though they need to have more and more people help. And yet the help they're giving is creating things that are getting worse. So that doesn't make a lot of sense any more than it does for each of us. So I'm talking about the individuality of this in the way that the microcosmic issues functioning at the macrocosmic level, both being cosmic.
I can see my dad rolling his eyes right there at that point. I could see my dad rolling his eyes at that point. The macroeconomic, microeconomic, cosmic.
Well, it's macrocosmic and microcosmic. It's how we're seeing the whole. None of us are having independent experiences that aren't affecting everything that's happening. So to think of it as only us alone is to think we're distinct and separate from that macrocosmic world. And to think of it macrocosmically begins to account for our part in everything that's happening. And again, it's both cosmically. What's cosmic? Whole universe. It's not just something, sometime, somewhere, somehow. It's now, everywhere, all the time, with everything. Everything, whether we've even imagined it exists. There are things that we have not even come to terms with that we admit, and there are things that we have not come to terms with that we have no idea could be admitted.
And you said all that eating blueberries.
It doesn't mean we need to think of them for them to be, which again shows how thinking is something that is designed to help us physically interact collectively. It's designed to help us. It's designed to be something that's utilitarian in nature, like an engine in a car. Wouldn't be much use to have a car unless you always lived at the top of a hill and never wanted to get back. So humility this month is the 7th step principle, and all principles are combined. All principles are effectively love, like all colors add up to white light. And white light is a shadowless, absolute, pure state of light, something most of us have never witnessed, and yet is witnessed by people who have those near-death experiences. That awareness becomes clear because my experience is they're pushed so far beyond the bounds of their thinking, their experiences so far beyond the bounds of their thinking, that they immediately start to see what's always been present, that they have been preoccupied making believe wasn't present because all they thought was present was what they were thinking was present. So if that's the case, we can, living without near-death experiences, even though we're always near death to the degree that we never know what it's going to happen in terms of our physical demise or disintegration. But we could also, it's testament to the fact that we could also probably, if not absolutely, live in the face of that awareness and introduce our human experience to that awareness, because we've always been that awareness. We've always had that awareness. It hasn't gone anywhere. While we've been making believe that we were so powerful to create reality and truth, we basically dismissed reality and truth and made believe that because we could dismiss it in thought, that denial was in fact the winner, when all it did was create delusional ideas and insane concepts that had become thought of as human nature, when in fact it is not human to be unnatural. It's unnatural human seeming nature. To call it natural is to think abnormality is natural. And this is all about mental issues. It's not to say people don't have defects that they're born with and all that. We've had great impact on the DNA through chemicals and pesticides and all kinds of things that people have been eating for years that have transformed the DNA to dysfunction because nature doesn't know what to do with toxins. For the most part, they're poisons, they're contaminants. So it unravels and impacts the structure. DNA changes over time. It's generally adapting to help us survive. And when we're imposing things on it that destroy it, it becomes maladaptive, and things as a result are manifest, by the way, Anthony. So my sense is, to your earlier point, we are manifesting everything that's happening that is a result of our impact on everything that's happening. So that would take manifestation a lot further than thinking we need to be successful or get a new car or have a big house or have a certain amount of money, to beginning to realize that we are actually all participants in manifesting everything that's happening right now as it's happening. We're major contributors, donors. And to think of it as any less than that is to think we have nothing to do with it, and as a result, there's nothing we can do about it. And that would be a major disqualification of the capacity we have to see things accurately, think of those things honestly, and speak about them accurately and honestly. We're seeing a lot of misrepresentation of things, a lot of sensationalism in society, social media trying to promote ideas that are true or not. I'm not going to argue in either direction, but I would say a lot of what seems most sensational is thinking of things in the most absurd, insane ways.
What happens if somebody's trying to start a business, a charitable business, help animals, and they're doing really well, but they have a lot of thoughts and there's a lot of bills and they don't know about decisions? Would you tell them, well, just don't think of, you can't think about things. You're not thinking, and they're worried about things that could happen in business. How do you get around that? You're going to have worry. At some point, your thinking is what's doing everything, and you're going to have to deal with how you're thinking about things. You can't just ignore thinking.
So it sounds like you're presuming what I'm saying is not to pay attention to thinking.
I'm saying you're thinking. You're saying don't think, that you're not supposed to really.
But
think.
are you hearing that? Think about that, Anthony. Have I ever said don't think? You ever heard that?
You say don't worry about it. There's a knowing source, and it'll take care of everything.
I didn't say that. I said there's an absolute knowing source. Doesn't mean if that's our essence, everything's already taken care of. There isn't anything to take care of in that absolute knowing source. Our struggle isn't with what we know. It isn't with our essence. Our struggle is with what we're thinking about our human experience. And when we're wrong and we deny that we have an absolute source, we think it's up to us to be absolutely correct all the time, when in fact, process of elimination is basically how we learn to function. If something's wrong, we correct it. If something's right, we benefit from it. And we know that we can reapply that thinking rightly over and over and over again, like a farmer can plant seeds. If they threw them up in the air and thought that they would plant themselves and wondered why they didn't because the birds ate the seeds on the surface of the ground, and then shit them out somewhere else on somebody else's field and they were growing over there, that would not be a very productive way of farming. So what we're talking about is how capable we are of dysfunction in our thinking, and as a result, dysfunctioning in our actions. And I don't think I've ever said, don't worry. I said it to you earlier. You said you were worried about something or another. And I said, what I said is, you don't have to worry about it. It's a certainty. But you can worry about it. You're welcome to worry about it. You are free, and everyone is free to think what they want. The point earlier about everybody making these decisions about how they're hearing what they're hearing in this discussion is the fact that we are each able to freely make decisions according to our own thoughts. And nobody ever makes those for us. Nobody, ever. So we have an independent, seemingly independent capacity that affects everything. And we are affected by everything in that independence. And all of our thinking about it is coming from all of the things that are happening around us in terms of our experience. So if we're thinking that's our only source, all we're ever thinking about is what our experience has been, which means we're in sort of a stagnant loop of thinking about itself, and it's never going to offer any great insight, because we're going to defensively protect ourselves, like Gabe said. Hard for somebody to admit they're defending. We don't tend to think we see it because we think it's imperative and it's the only thing we can do. We go blind to what we're doing, and we're not really blind. We're just looking at something that has no basis, that has nothing to see. When you look at darkness clearly, you're not blind. You're seeing pitch black as pitch black. That isn't blindness. That's actually seeing clearly pitch blackness. So we can say we don't see it, but I'll tell you what we do see and notice are the effects. And to deny the effects, my suspicion, my expectation, my experience is that we deny the effects to turn them into the cause so we can avoid the cause and claim we have nothing to do with it. So what do we try to do? Get over the effects. We try to fix the effects. We try to feel better about the effects. And what are we doing? Cementing the idea that the cause is intractable, permanent, and absolute because we think it's true and real. That also, pointed out earlier with Gabe and Laura Alice, points to the fact that we know what reality is. Permanent, absolute, unchangeable. In the things we do that we think we're not doing, we're admitting the things we think aren't happening, and yet acting as though they're not. That's insanity. It's delusion. It's complete dysfunction. And yet we seem to be able to function despite it, showing that we have an awareness well beyond the thinking we're doing and the dysfunction we're creating. It's actually a very small component that we make too much of to maintain the contention we have nothing to do with it and can't fix it. It's impossible. There's nothing I can do about it while we're creating it. How can we create something and have nothing to do with it? How can we create something and not be able to do anything about it? If the present moment is always new and always available and always have all possibilities, certainly the one possibility that all we can keep doing is the same thing we've already done over and over and over again can't be true, except to something focused so narrowly on a point, trying to make that point truth and reality, and it will never be true or real, no matter how closely we focus and how hard we think. Thinking about thinking creates thoughts. It doesn't create myself. It doesn't create a persona. It doesn't create a character. I use those characters I create to begin to assign things to give this thing I think is real qualities that are familiar to me, that are contained in other people. Things I think I want. I want to look like that guy. I want to look like the way I think he is by how he looks or she. I want to have the things that give the impression of what I think that guy has the impression of, not noticing that the internal landscape of other people's experience is often drastically different than we presume, because they look like they have the things we want, because we're thinking superficially about the thing we are, which is simply turning an illusion, an imagined thought, into reality. Can't happen, won't happen, never. But it can always be imagined, just like thinking can always be thinking. And I'm not suggesting, again, not to think. I'm suggesting that we do not need to use thinking so improperly and so mistakenly that it gives us the impression that we're condemned and that the only thing we can do is have contempt for others. and that it's impossible for us to ever get anything done, and nobody's ever going to do this, and nobody's ever going to do that. Interesting how sure we are about everybody else while we're living in doubt ourselves. And we think that way. We think in global terms with certainty, and we talk about it with bravado and confidence while we're quaking in our own boots, trying to figure out what the hell's going on in our own experience. And it doesn't have to be pronounced to be obvious, to begin to notice that this nature is very subtle, or seems subtle, or we can think it's subtle, so we can deny that it's happening hard enough and long enough and bad enough to pay attention to. If it's happening at all, it's probably happening a lot of the time. It's not something we're picking up and dropping. We would have no, if we were dropping it and not doing it, we would have plenty of experience to suggest it's not something we have to do. So we must be doing it at some level, a lot, which basically is making believe that an idea we have is true and real when it's simply a thought that's wrong. And having a wrong thought isn't even wrong, Anthony. Having wrong thoughts is not a problem. I've never said don't have wrong thoughts. Thinking they're right is the problem.
True.
Thinking thoughts go, as soon as we think they're true and real, we're having them as they are not. And all of a sudden it becomes incumbent on us to keep thinking about them that way, to give them that impression. And that impression in time becomes depressing as we live through successive seeming moments that are basically just the newness of the present state of being that we're always witnessing.
Thank you.
So if we all share this, if we have it, if it's essential, it's not something we can each have and someone else can't have. So noticing this is the same for everyone is beginning to actually burst the bubble about all the thinking we do about everybody else. It's also untrue. Because most of the impact, we don't even think we're doing what we're doing internally. So we act out and make believe other people are doing it to us, just like we think our thoughts and our ego and our brain are attacking us. We use other people to begin to excuse what we're doing so we can blame it on them, which we were sort of approaching a little bit earlier, Anthony. I think it was in my earlier conversation. Maybe it was Gabe. So to think of it as something
talking about that, Jack, at the end in the car, it's like the other person, being married 30 years, 15 years, or like spending time with people and using them to feel a certain way, or like you said, the street sign is what it is, but that was the context that we were talking about.
So the point is, if we're living with somebody a long period of time and we start having ideas about how they are, we're not seeing them, we're seeing what we're thinking about them. And humility, the little intro I did about humility this week, is really recognizing that humility is just letting things be as they are. And it's not because we let them be, it's because they are how they are. So coming to terms with that again shows that it's not thinking that lets things be. And yet when thinking begins to allow things to be, it begins to allow my human experience to function on a level that's accurate enough to be interacting rather than interreactive with what's happening. So as an interaction, I'm taking in what other things are. They're addressing me. They're introducing themselves to me. Even if I was pointing out a street sign and it happened to have, it was Lincoln Boulevard, happened to be oriented a little bit to the left. I said, so that sign is that sign. It is what it is. It says what it says. I don't have to understand the language to understand that it is what it is. I don't have to be able to read. But when I look at it, I start thinking, oh, that's not centered. It's not symmetrical. It's blue. It's got a line around it. It's all these things come to mind because I'm relating to it. But a lot of what I'm thinking has nothing to do with the sign. It has everything to do with what I'm thinking about the sign. And this idea that things are only what we think of them is to dismiss anything they may be beyond our thoughts. And now we have limited our relationship with things and wonder why we feel less than and why things seem scarce. It's the scarcity of the thinking that things are only what we think that's conceding the thinking we're doing is very small compared to what is capable of conceding and acknowledging. So in that, Anthony, my estimation is that thinking is literally designed to express reality and truth without having to think of it at all. And that's effectively what intuition is. Intuition is defined as knowledge beyond reason, so it means there's no understanding or thought in it. It's the knowing we know, we know. It's the awareness we're aware we're aware. It's the state of that being that automatically knows, and what it offers me is not a decision on how I run a dental office, but it offers me the clear awareness of whether what I'm thinking is at peace, which would be aligned with an absolute state of being that doesn't change because there's no conflict in it because it doesn't change. Something that's perfectly still can't cause issues. There are no issues for it to cause. It's the sum total of everything, including the possibility for me to think what I want, think that it's wrong, and make believe it's right. It's part of the freedom that we're given. But it's not anything other than what I'm thinking about that's causing that. It isn't reality causing that. It isn't my brain causing that. It isn't my thoughts causing that. It's my decision to misutilize them and not notice the discomfort and the lack of ease, the dis-ease that occurs, and think that by not noticing it, it's not happening, and wonder why things keep happening that I thought were resolved. Because I'm not allowing my sensitivity, my sentient nature, to acknowledge there are things wrong even when I'm right about something. There are other things that still seem to be brewing and creating a sense of darkness and a sense of weight and a sense of depression. And what is that? Certainly not inspired, certainly not spontaneous. It is spontaneous, but it appears to be ages old, my history, something I've always done, something that started when I was 3 years old, and not noticing it didn't start when I was 3. It didn't start or end when I was 3. I'm still thinking like a 3-year-old because I haven't resolved what actually happened as what happened. And I've still been thinking about it as something that's still happening. So I become the cause of the thing that I've been blaming on somebody when I was 3. In my present, that traumatic experience cannot be overcome by continuing to maintain it. And I would say it's a present traumatic stress that has been imposed on our own experience and our experience of others that has compromised our capacity to function at levels that are abundant and loving and caring and sufficient to resolve problems immediately because we're not busy remaking them. The beauty about nature is when we stop acting unnatural, nature becomes obvious. Because we're not standing in the flurry of thoughts that give us the distraction and the potential to pull ourselves away. We're not really ever doing it anyhow. We're just imagining we are. We're just conveniently using these tactics to give ourselves the impression that what we're doing is right and real and the only thing we can do. It's not true. So as I talked about with Gabe, in my relationship with Katie, I began to say to her, these are thoughts I have. I'm going to share with you. I think if I'm thinking things, I'm perfectly able to speak to those things I'm thinking as things I'm thinking rather than things that are an indictment of what you're doing or what I think about what you're doing or things I think you shouldn't be doing or things I think I want you to know you're doing so that you can understand how I'm feeling about what you're doing. So I started sharing thoughts with her and say, this is a thought. She'd say, oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting thought. I say, yeah. Do you notice that it doesn't feel like an attack? Doesn't feel like I'm trying to demand anything of you? She said, yeah, little. But a couple days later said, I have some thoughts too. So our discussions have been actually very funny. And I think part of what we talked about earlier, Gabe, is that this thinking about this can seem very heavy and very difficult and very complicated. But effectively, what we're really thinking about that's serious is the seriousness that we take the self we think we are. And if that self is actually a joke, meaning it's just an imposter, it's got a costume on that's pretending it's a fireman, but can't seem to figure out how to put a fire out, then I've dressed this whole thing up to give the impression it's real and true, this whole concept of who I think I am, that is nothing more than a joke. And as soon as I think it's real and true, I take it seriously because I think my life depends on maintaining it. And so everything that happens that isn't according to my thinking, I take personally and don't think is very funny as a result. So there's no humor in it. So the totality of an absolute state engages both ends, the serious end, the laughable end. Begins to reveal that opposites are the same because they're connected. The common ground between them connects them. They're not independent of one another. I can take a position, but the position becomes untenable at some point because it's connected to the other side and it's going to somehow flex. Like I'm on a bungee cord. The longer I stretch it, the tighter it seems to get. But it's really just reminding me that it's going to eventually snap back and bring me closer to that point I thought I could get away from. So it's only a joke and I'm treating it seriously. I take it personally. And what do people say? Don't take things so personally. Don't take yourself so seriously. And I think we covered that a little bit earlier. But contemplating that gives rise to the potential to start looking at something that seems so difficult to let go of. And it's really nothing more than a joke that we're not laughing at. It's been taken so seriously as to make believe that somehow being more serious about it is going to fix it, when in fact it's the idea that it's serious to begin with that is broken. There's nothing there but illusion. It's nothing there but a thought. And it doesn't, because I've done it for a seemingly long time, doesn't mean I'm doing what has to be done because I've always done it, because it's free. I'm free in the moment to do or not do whatever I'm doing and thinking. Always free, always new, always now, always. So if that is true, if it's accurate for all of us. We may think of it in different ways, and none of this is incumbent to think of in the way I speak of it, but to start to notice your own experience and start to notice the turmoil and notice the disturbances and notice the obsessions and notice the compulsions and the impulses and the reactivity and the sensitivity to what other people are saying. And if any of this has any validity, if you apply the idea that thoughts are just thoughts, people are thinking all the time, it's not something to stop because it's something that actually we do. It just happens. It's how we take care of ourselves. It's how we breathe. We may breathe naturally, but the depth of our breath is determined by our willingness to notice how our posture is and whether or not we're actually taking in more or less oxygen, just like eating. We each choose what we're going to put down our throat. It's the same thing with the thinking. So that idea, Gabe, that seemed to occur to you today for the first time, or in a way that you sort of got it. If I'm talking to myself and I'm talking seemingly, if I'm thinking about myself and talking to myself, I'm really thinking about my thoughts, and I'm thinking to my thoughts.
Yeah, that's what's crazy.
So think of the simplicity of that compared to the imagination, this conversion that we've made to thinking it's ourself. I've been thinking to myself. Well, if I'm thinking to myself, there's two of me going at that. And one must be false if there's two. And so who am I in that? I am the creator of those thoughts. I am the one willing to have those thoughts. I am the one engaging in those thoughts. I'm the observer watching these choices I make. And if I forego that greater awareness, which would be to dismiss reality and truth and dismiss that there's anything absolute and anything infinite and anything that could even be called God. And that's just a name we use. God does not have a label on him and say, you didn't recognize me. I actually happen to be God. It's a consciousness. It's an awareness. It's an absolute knowing state of being. We have humanized God and dispirited humans. We think of God as something that comes and goes, takes and gives. We need to pray to it constantly to get what we want. If an infinite source is infinite, we already have everything. The question is, why do we keep thinking we don't? Because the thing we have that we call ourselves doesn't exist and we know it. So we don't think it's ever enough to solve any of the problems that we keep trying to fix. In a way, we're admitting.
We keep talking to it.
Huh?
We keep talking to it.
Yes, well, that dialogue. Well, as I mentioned earlier, and anyone listening, try this. Start listening to the conversation you have in your head. My experience is most of the guys, the hundreds of guys I've worked with over the years, initially think, I don't do that. And within a week, they start saying, well, you know what? I did start hearing some things that are not very kind. Pretty abusive. And pretty soon they realize nobody's ever talked to them the way they talk to themselves. And why would that be if we actually love that self? If the reality and truth is born of love, and this self we create that's untrue and will never be true must be born of fear and hate and loathing and contempt and condemnation. Because why? It's condemned to never existing, except in the thinking we do about it. Doesn't have any basis but thinking. So obsessively thinking about it doesn't turn it into reality and truth. It simply diminishes our capacity to function fully as humans. And that doesn't make us feel bad. It doesn't make us feel wrong. It simply shows that the bad thinking and the wrong thinking is unproductive and not useful and not functional. And we're never going to fix that self by offering it more and more and more and more stuff. And to start seeing this, you'll start seeing that a lot of the things you thought you needed disappear. Because there's a satisfaction and wholeness that's immediate to the nature of our actual existence that does not waver. It does not come and go. It cannot be diminished. It cannot be increased. There is no size or shape to it. There is no time in it. It is literally beginning to notice that these dimensions that humans have designed to make believe we're in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth dimension are all simultaneous and immediate to our experience right now. They're all the nature of our essence. They're not divided the way we think of them any more than the sun goes down or the sun is not out when the clouds are out. The sun is always up. It's always shining. It does not go down and it does not come up. We go around. We either move toward it or we move away from it, giving the appearance that it's coming up or down. But we talk about things as they appear, not always as they are. If we're thinking of our thinking only as it appears, we're thinking who we are is what we think.
Yeah, that's significant.
MK, good morning.
That's a great analogy on the sun.
Well, think of
Appearances.
my contention with the idea that the horizon was doomed or caused doom was not the horizon people were worried about, but the thought they had that was limited, they believed was true. Right? So the limit of their thought became the horizon, and what they saw in the horizon was the horizon was doomed. But interestingly enough, if you approach the horizon, which within thought means self-centeredness, this idea that our self is at the center, means that it's the furthest from the edge, because the center point in a circle is as far from the edge as possible. That would seem to create safety if, in fact, that edge was doomed. Right?
Right.
So the metaphoric experience with the horizon is that was the doom, that what they have feared was reaching that place they couldn't see beyond. And because they couldn't see beyond it, it meant that there was an absolute abyss beyond it of nothing. Fearful, hateful, doomed us. So what's the presumption in the thought? That the horizon of the thought is the beginning of the end, the beginning of nothing. What is that saying? All we think that's true and real is the limits of the thought. And anything beyond it is absolute oblivion. rather than beginning to see that the end of a thought is the beginning of everything else that actually exists, and then seeing that the everything that exists is also within that thought, being denied by the thought to make believe, because it would completely undermine the point of the thought to concede that absolutely the absolute nature of existence is the thought. The thought is already in that existence. It's already part of it. It's just being used in a way that's completely delusional and insane. So the good news is insanity will never be sane. And if the basis of our existence is sane, we're never technically insane. We're just acting insane. We're thinking insane. We're utilizing things by misutilizing them and wondering why it undermines our capacity to feel fulfilled and complete and whole and able in ways that are typically, we don't even have to think about. We just do it. Why are we not better in our relationships? Why do we regret when somebody dies and think of all the things we could have done, rather than doing them with the people that do exist now? And notice that that's the tribute we can give anybody who's died, is to really give ourselves in ways we thought we should have given them, but only think of it once they're gone, rather than think of it while we can do something about it. That's a very addictive form of thinking. Thinking we're better off than people who are worse off is a very addictive form of thinking. It's very sick to think that we're actually better because somebody else is suffering. That's just, I mean, it's laughable to see it as ridiculous as it is, compared to think of it as something we have to now map out some new way to fight and develop a new sort of skin around, like a scab, to prevent ourselves from experiencing, rather than saying the experience of it is actually the accuracy of our awareness. If we're being honest, if we're allowing ourselves that experience and saying, wow, this disturbance is clearly telling me something is wrong, not with me, but what I'm doing with my thinking. My essence is not my thinking, so I can't be wrong in that essence. If that essence is all that exists, it must be right. And what would be right about it? That it will work every time whenever it's applied. And what's applied? The peaceful nature of my steps and the issues. If I'm in turbulence over what I'm thinking, I'm probably not thinking something that's right. I'm thinking of it in ways that are left to thought. Maybe it works a little bit. It won't work forever, though. Eventually, that culmination of all the wrong will add up to a point where something will break. It'll lead to the desperation Anthony was talking about earlier about running an office. All of a sudden, all the shaky foundations, if you have $1 million credit line in a business and you've got most of it left, you can make a lot of mistakes and think you're doing fine. But eventually the bankruptcy becomes clear, and it's not the eventuality of what's happening. It's the little tiny thoughts along the way that were overlooked that realize that eventuality. We can realize it now because it's actually happening now, and it's actually realized in everything that is happening right now. And that, I would say, is what we call self-actualization and self-realization, is actually just actualizing and realizing the potential our thinking has to express reality and truth, and the potential it has to dysfunction by making believe it is real and true. So it's thought realization and thought actualization. Are we actually realizing its potential by expressing what we know, or are we trying to make believe all we know is what we think? So considering these things starts to give you a chance to notice by the things that start to become clear, seemingly unexpectedly or beyond your imagination, because you're no longer thinking about them. You're just starting to witness the experience of the totality. MK, what's happening? Other than everything. I thought I heard you say something.
No, sorry, I was just making my shake, but apologies.
Well, good morning.
You as well. Actually found one of those meetings I was asking you about here in the Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently it's the longest running speaker meeting in Phoenix. Been running for 60 years.
Is it in Scottsdale or Phoenix?
It's in Scottsdale.
Yeah, that's where I thought it was. Good. So you found it. It's Friday night, right?
Yes, it is. It's Friday night at 7. It was pretty good. It was a pretty solid turnout as well.
So you found it. Good.
Yeah. I feel like I'm like
all roads
trespassing
lead
when
to
I
where you're going. So we were talking today, since you're coming in a little bit late, the idea that we take seriously what's effectively a joke. And because we take this serious thing personally, we don't think it's funny. And some of us are taking a walk in the morning before we have the conversation on Sunday to start to flesh out some of the points that we could potentially make to make conceiving of this a little simpler than the extent that I often talk about it. Since I've been talking about it so long, I probably talk more about things that don't need to be said. So we're looking at boiling things down in ways that might be a little easier to digest or a little more readily digestible or easy. My sense is if everybody knows it, I don't need to say much, and not much needs to be said. And yet if what's said is specific enough and clear enough, it can offer a little perspective to start to consider things that might otherwise seem inconsiderate or inconsiderable. So seeing it as a joke and starting to realize that it's not funny when we take it seriously is one way of noticing that this fraudulent self that we've created, that is all based on what we think, doesn't have any basis other than thought. And obsessive thinking is the byproduct of thinking of itself. It's just producing more thought. It isn't producing a self. It isn't producing a who we are. It isn't producing a body or an entity or a live being. It isn't producing anything substantive. It's literally producing a projection, which is an appearance. So self-consciousness is defined as undue regard for appearance. It's interesting. If it was really referring to a consciousness, that would be an elevated state of awareness. And yet it's talking about the fact that we're overly concerned about how we look. And I would say that's a pretty good indication. If the effects are obvious to us and we're willing to admit them, they're admitting the cause that's causing them. They're admitting how the effects are coming from a cause. And if the cause is seen clearly, if the effects are seen clearly, they're telling us what the cause is.
Well, you're kind of touching on something that I like. That it's a faint conversation in my head that goes on, but I think a lot about the human experience and interactions I have with people, the things they believe, the things they share, the things they struggle with, the things that they create. And I can't remember the show I was watching, but it was like all things that breathe or something of that sort. And it just made me think about, we're all just living beings on this planet. Like that is a fact. Anything that's breathing and living here on this planet are, in my mind, all equal. But there's an obsession with humans to think that they are greater than everything else that's on this planet. And it made me start to consider humans do a wonderful job of making the planet better for them, because that's what we think. But like, in what way? I mean, and I've came to the conclusion that planet would still exist if humans didn't exist anymore. It would just exist in a different shape or form. There wouldn't be structures, because clearly everything that humans create is for the benefit of humans for the most part. But our minds, I can't have that conversation with people because it would strike too far deep to their ego or what they think of themselves.
Well, you can. And
I have that argument.
The essence of this is to start mentioning these are just thoughts I'm having rather than things I need to impress on you and things you need to believe too.
Yeah, and that's why this is probably the first time I've ever said it out loud. Maybe I said it to Anna, but I just feel like it gives me a better understanding of how strong our ideologies can be and how attached we are to them.
Yes. So the part of the thinking too is that all we've done is good for us, when in fact, most of what we've done has a consequential aspect to it that we haven't fully realized, but are starting to, and seeing the destruction that it's caused in the name of doing the best we can. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly this idea that the subtlety of our awareness right now, when we're disturbed, that we can dismiss because we think it's not significant enough to pay attention to, builds to a point where things occur that we say, how does this happen again?
Mhm.
We have a nervous breakdown. We fall apart because all of a sudden what's falling apart are all the ideas we had that were invested in the thoughts we have about who we think we are, when in fact, those are always, if they're corrupt to start with, if they're lies to begin with, we're going to only pursue them with lies to make believe that somehow doing more of the same thing will become true. Because truth would vanish the whole concept. It's such essentially because truth doesn't see it. It's all done in our thinking. It's all something created in our thinking. God doesn't look at us and see all the delusions we're having, because it would be God would have to be insane to be able to be capable of that. This is literally a human dilemma, a human experience created by humans, because we've been given the freedom to do whatever we think we want. Literally. And we've used and misused our thinking rather than turn it into something gainful and productive for everyone. We've claimed all the great strides we've had while denying the consequences, and we're just starting to look at those consequences. You know, I was looking at tires today and thinking of all the tires that have been made for all the cars, and we have no solution for what to do with the rubber. Zero. We can't reuse it. They sometimes grind it up, pulverize it, turn it into gym mats, asphalt. They've come up with some things to do with it, but for the most part, there are hundreds of thousands and millions of tires sitting in places that eventually catch fire, and they can't put the fires out. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those fires burning, and then the rubber basically melts into a soot that goes into the sky, and it ends up landing in different. It ends up being part of the thing that we call pollution. If the thought is polluted, it's going to create pollution. That's Anthony, to your point earlier, I know you're just stepping back in here, but if my thought is contaminated, I'm going to manifest contamination. I'm going to try to make believe it's the thing I manifest that is the problem, rather than the manifestation of the thinking that's creating it. The whole issue of addiction is trying to treat effects rather than the cause. As soon as we recognize the cause and admit it, bam, all of a sudden it seems to make no sense to continue doing the thing we've been doing, because it never made any sense all along, except when we thought of it only in relation to what we thought we needed to stop, rather than started asking, what is it that I keep starting? And it's always a thought, because if the moment's always new, we're always restarting the thinking. Thinking it's the only thing we can do.
Well, and the meeting I went to on Friday, he touched on, the gentleman speaking, he touched on how the first time he ever had a drink, it like literally just flipped a switch. Like his life changed in a week. He went from, drinking to cocaine to heroin. Like in a week, he'd basically ran the gamut. And he just thought that was normal. Everything was fine. Years blew by, accidents, all kinds of crazy stuff. But as he got older, he stopped drinking for, I think, 6 years. And he was at a party. And he's like, oh, yeah, I can have a glass of champagne. Had a glass of champagne. He's like, that flip switched again. He's like, it went off. He's like, and it took him time to understand that it's just, he can't do that. It's nothing other than a same result, same cause and effect, but expecting a different result. And I think about that at times. I'm like, oh, I could probably have one. Like, what's the big deal? Like, I'll be fine. I can manage. It's like, yeah, but one turns into two, turns into three, turns into unmanageable. And I already know the result of that. But the fact that I still entertain the thought is always like, wow, that's, I know
recovery is regaining perspective. As soon as you see it with perspective, when you do A, B is going to occur.
Yep.
When you think that you take that thought seriously, that you can have the first drink, and you take it seriously enough, you're going to do it to prove you're right. And you know what it proves? You're wrong. And you know why you need another one? You got to keep proving. It's the exact same replica of the thinking. If I think a lie is true, I'm going to think another lie is true, and I'm going to keep thinking lies are true successfully and keep digging myself deeper, wondering why the impressions they create become so depressing and so immobilizing and demoralizing as time passes. I'm pretending it's not happening because the effect hasn't been as bad as it could be, when in fact I'm ignoring the impact that it is having. It builds, it grows, it continues to develop. What happens, happens. And the results are always going to be the result. It isn't about not thinking. It's about starting to see that when we think in ways that aren't true, we're going to continue thinking in ways that aren't true. It isn't until we say, this isn't true, that we begin seeing that it's simply a thought we're having, not an edict, not a demand, not a requirement, not an eventuality that we absolutely need to maintain. Not at all. That's recovery. Starting to see things clearly, honestly, as they are, rather than as we think they are. So there's a thing in the big book that says that one of the basic ideas of an alcoholic is to think that they can drink like normal people. What do they think is normal? People that look like they're not having the same impact that is happening to the alcoholic, because the impact on the alcoholic is an internal demoralization that they generally don't mention on the exterior, like you just said. I've never talked about this. We don't tend to speak honestly about the experiences we're having, so we think of them as something that's unique to us and something separate from everybody else, and nobody's ever going to understand, when in fact the mechanics of it are identical. Circumstances, the colors, the shapes, the people, the time, the place, all seem to be different and give us the impression that somehow we're unique, when in fact the underlying issue is identical and always the same, and will always do that. So the idea that I can think lies and not be impacted by them is the idea that a lie could be true, where the impact would be valuable and reassuring and reinforcing of productivity and usefulness and gainfulness and worthwhileness, rather than demoralizing and feeling less than and feeling low self-worth and low self-esteem and all of those other things that reflect and will always reflect based on that thinking, the exact same thing. So to think the job is to feel better about those things is to actually reinforce the idea that the thinking we're doing that's wrong is the only thinking we can do. My experience is talking about it, putting it out in the open air, begins to realize that thoughts vaporize as quickly as we mention them. They don't seem to have the impact that they have when we keep them to ourselves and let them become part of that recirculation of the drain that's just constantly swirling and moving downward like a cyclone. Our actions are reflections for the thinking we do, and compulsions are expressions of obsessive thinking. And they are never healthy for us in any way. They can seem like a solution, like we can think that we're serving humankind by doing all the advancements we've been doing and overlook the impact they've had on the actual natural environment that doesn't seem to get better because we continue to do things worse. It's all based in thinking. And to think nobody's ever going to understand this is to make believe that they are exactly as we were when we made believe there was nothing wrong with what we were doing. To impose that on other people in mass is to want to only see them do that thing, rather than, because we think that's all they're going to do, rather than start to realize they're going to do whatever they do, and they have the capacity of doing things as right as I've learned to do, regardless of what I think of them, regardless of how I limit them, regardless of how I think they are condemned to doing only what I used to do. It's just another form of lie. It's another subtlety of this insanity that we've developed into thinking is normal when it's abnormal and unnatural and unhealthy and unwise. It's certainly not the best we can do, and as a result, the only thing we can do. So to take it seriously is not that funny. All of these predicaments that seem so hard are no more difficult than we continue to make believe they're difficult. And the marriage to that thought is not sacred, and it is not a vow. And till death do us part may be the only part of it that actually lives up to its terminology, because it does undermine our body's capacity to live fully, usefully, and healthy. Creates disease. And there again, Anthony, is a manifestation of thought.
Do you believe in using it for positive thoughts? For sure.
I believe it's designed to be, I don't think of it as positive or negative. I think of it as useful and gainful. And typically what we think positive and negative are the same things in the universe. They're different ends of the same things in the universe. Neutrons and positrons and all that stuff have different functions. And what my experience of negative is for humans is trying to negate things. It's trying to pretend they don't exist. That's what's negative. So negative thoughts are my busyness trying to pretend something that's happening isn't happening because I can pretend it's not happening and think it's not happening and imagine because I'm thinking and pretending it's not happening. So my sense is we are designed to be productive and useful and helpful and cooperative and supportive and loving and caring. That's our purpose. That's what nature does. Nature's provided us everything we've ever utilized on this planet. Everything, all those things we think we built in our favor, MK, came from nature, which gave it to us without hesitation. We want it, it gives itself to us. It doesn't say, oh no, you're going to use this for something that's going to cause a problem 50 years from now.
You know, I realized as we were talking, one thing that I did last week that I don't like is I didn't like certain thoughts I was having. So I wanted to block those thoughts out and I kept concentrating on I just really got to not think about that anymore. It's bothering me. So I don't think that was the right way to do it. I think I should have looked at it more and not, I was just really I'm not, how do I stop thinking about this? I don't want to think about that anymore.
But Anthony, if you're admitting by simply observing what you're doing that you are aware of what you're doing, and by beginning to admit that, it makes the chance to do or not do much greater. Yeah. Rather than think it's the only, when you think it's the only thing you can do, you think you're blind to other options. That's the nature of what addiction appears to be. So your own awareness of it is the beginning of saying, oh, I'm actually doing this. Oh, I see that. And I guarantee you, as you consider that, you'll start saying, I don't have to do that. It becomes laughable that we ever thought we had to do the things that gave us the impression that we were dying and being killed by it.
The problem is I didn't think about it till now. At the time, I was just I forgot, but I'm only thinking about it now. So yeah, it's great to think about it, but I didn't think about it at the time when I needed it.
But you were aware of it. It's okay. Right. Listen, it's perfectly okay to do what we do. As long as we think we shouldn't be doing what we're doing, we're treating the effects, we're trying to stop something and not notice the cause. As soon as you have a relation to it and say, wow, if I'm creating this effect, I must be creating the cause. I can't be feeling the effect and aware of the effect and not be part of the cause. That transition becomes obvious. And since it's fundamental to thinking, you never have to think of every thought to notice it with any thought you have. It becomes very quick. And I must be doing that again. I must be doing that with this thought. Doesn't mean it's going to go away immediately, but as you notice it for what it is, it will start to dissolve very quickly and eventually they'll just dissolve like that. And you'll laugh immediately and say, here I go again. Some circumstance pushed me beyond a limit I thought I presumed was true. And all of a sudden I'm wondering why I'm reactive and impulsive and compulsive in relation to it. I'm trying to control things to the limits of my thoughts because I think my thoughts are the limits of reality and truth. It's not true. You get more flexible and start realizing everything that's ever happened is all that's ever happened. And if everything that's ever happened is all that's ever happened, and I begin to expect everything to happen as it happens, I don't have a lot of expectations based on thinking my thoughts are true, thinking that all that should happen is only what I think. I just start saying, okay, this is just another thing that could have happened. Of course, this could have happened.
Right.
Now, it doesn't mean, Anthony, that I like it. I mean, that's a whole other element. I may still say, you know what? I'd prefer that this thing wasn't happening, and yet it's happening. So I can have that freedom to have a preference and make a choice about it without feeling condemned to it, because I'm not trying to deny what's happening. I'm trying to say, you know what? I really prefer when this doesn't happen. I'd really rather that not happen, rather than think it shouldn't be happening. So I'm going to demand that it isn't happening and pretend that it isn't happening while it's happening and wondering why it keeps happening. It's just having it as it is. That's exactly what humility is, letting things be. You know why? It's already what they are. Things are how they are right now, regardless of what we think. In all respects, in all ways, in all places, in all things that exist, everywhere. They're just how they are, what they are, where they are, now. whatever they are. I don't have to think about the details to know generally how to think about everything in a way that's peaceful enough to begin to contemplate the vastness of things that are
More big picture.
well beyond what I'm thinking. But
Yeah, I started
to
to micromanage. I wasn't looking at the big picture again.
Well, but think of what you're doing as something you can do rather than something you shouldn't be doing. And you'll start seeing that when you do it, you're getting a result that you don't like. And you may just naturally say, you know what, I don't have to eat something I hate. Right. We all do that. We've eaten enough things to say, when it comes to thinking, we seem to have this allegiance to it because we believe it's true and think it's the only thing we can do. It isn't any truer than food becomes who we are, even though it does provide a molecular structure for our bodies to be healthy.
Yeah.
So too does the diminished capacity of our thinking undermine our molecular structure by stressing it and causing this internal experience that seems to be an emergency, but it's all created in thinking. It's all created in a mental experience. So that's good. I mean, you're aware, you've grown a lot in terms of your awareness. You've had those epiphanies that things like Gabe today, when he said, oh, I never even thought of the conversation. If we're creating a false self, we're obviously talking to ourself. Who are we? Who am I in the sentence? I was talking to myself. Clearly, I'm aware that I am not the self I'm talking to.
Yeah.
If that's the case, why is it so hard to consider these things? Well, because we've become masters at delusion and denial and pretense and pretending, all that stuff. And we think that's the art of life, managing things that are out of control because they're not even out of control. They have no basis to be in control. It's only thinking of them as something that they're only an illusion, making believe it's real, that thinks they can be out of control. There's no control in them whatsoever, which is why we have no control over them. To think we have control over something that's insane is to be insane thinking we can control it. So there is no control there. It's what the unmanageability is in the first step. It's not that we can't do anything. It's not that we can't think. It's not that we can't have an impact. It's not that we don't influence things. It's that we can't manage thoughts that are not true. Like, I can drink and use without consequence. I can control and enjoy my drinking or my drugs or my food or whatever it is I seem out of control of. There's a certain powerlessness that I've imposed on the effort that's all stemming from a thought I'm having about what I'm doing. I think eating is probably one of the best things to look at and see that we're all clearly aware of.
I just picked up a cookie right now. It's like you were watching me.
I was hearing you. Food is, here's something that's, if we're interested in health, we're required to do, right? It's a basic premise of living is eating and breathing. We don't tend to argue over our breathing. We don't tend to wonder whether there's going to be enough air. We just count on it because it's natural. It's the same with our thinking. When we start thinking about it in natural terms, we'll start realizing it's very utilitarian. It's very useful. It's very helpful. It's very well informed because it's actually based in reality and truth. And to think of it as exceptional to reality and truth is to think of it as completely distinct from it and having no connection to it. So all we do is rely on it, thinking that we need to prove the thought is correct so we don't concede what we also know, which is absolutely correct. So food is one of those things that is designed for nutrition. It's designed to feed our body. It's designed to help our body and all the chemicals in it function. And the better we eat, the better our body feels. Why? Because it's sensitive and aware, because it hasn't been desensitized by things that are actually killing it. But what do we tend to do? Food's more like a sport in our country. You want to eat more. You want to have more of the things that we like, more French fries, more fried foods, more things that aren't healthy for us. I'm not telling anybody any of it's wrong. Eat it if you want. It's up to you. The question is it healthy? And is it really something that we're doing as a result of what we need? Or is it another one of those things that is a result of the defective thinking we're having and the scarce thoughts we have that we think is going to fulfill us and fill us up and have us feel better because it tastes good, because we have momentary short-term relief and satisfaction, and yet we have this long-term consequence with it that is either unhealthy in our physical bodies or overweight in our physical bodies, where we can't quite sustain in the same way that we would if we were in fact healthy and eating for nutrition rather than sport, rather than flavor and texture and all the things that seem to be so critical. But it's an easy area to see how MK and I had lunch in Scottsdale recently. And I said I was just going to have one piece of pizza, and I think I had two, if I remember right.
You're obsessed.
Totally. I do not deal well with flour. So as soon as I get flour into my system, I want more flour. And allergies are typically defined as an abnormal response to something. The abnormality is wanting more of the thing that you should never have. And I do that with flour. I've largely given up sugar, but not completely. I'd had for years, but I dabble in it a little bit here and there. That doesn't seem to have as much impact on me as bread and things with flour in it, interestingly. I don't have the severe reaction. I used to get watering eyes and my throat would get a little bit lumpy, and it's not as significant because I don't do it as much. But the fact that I do it is a tempting of fate, that somehow I can do it in the satisfaction of eating it. We had pizza last night at Mozza Pizzeria, which is one of the best restaurants in Los Angeles, by a woman who cultivates her flour, and everything is so perfect and it's so tasty. But the lingering effect is much longer lasting than the satisfaction of the food. So I watch that and I notice it, and it's a good gauge because I can see how my thinking is based on my eating very often. When I'm at ease thinking,
I used to do that in the morning.
What's that?
I used to do that. I used to do that in the morning at an office I worked at. Somebody would bring in donuts, and I knew as soon as I ate the donuts, I just needed to go. There was just nothing left. I would be so tired from the sugar. But I'd always, you know what? I'm just going to have one. I cannot believe one donut is going to knock me out. And then sure enough, I would eat it. And that sugar, and I would try it every time. And I realized I just couldn't judge it.
Well, Anthony, keep in mind that donuts are also flour.
Uh-huh.
And flour is, flour originally came from whole grain, and we started pulverizing it, and it becomes a sort of glue in our system. It literally begins to stop up our system because it's so fine. It's like construction dust, like plaster. It's so fine. It's insidious. It's very hard to get rid of.
But I also remember for the first minute as I was eating it, I was going, yes, I was wrong this whole time. I really could. These are amazing.
Until you were downing the third donut.
Yeah, I was like, this is just, I was so wrong.
I once sat in a guy's house waiting for him for a meeting, and he was late, and it was Christmas, and they had some See's candy peanut brittle. And I started with a piece and I finished his whole box. And I was so embarrassed that I left and found a See's candy and bought one to replace it.
Wow.
And somehow didn't eat the second box.
Yeah.
So we get better in the actions we take as we get better in the mentality that we make. And it is a choice. The contents of our thought is a choice. Thinking may not be a choice, but an absolute state of being is not a choice either. And yet you can't be condemned. None of us can be condemned by having been given everything that there is. There is no condemnation in that because there is nothing kept from us. So that's interesting that love, in fact, given, if love is the nature of existence, if it's the nature of an infinite spirit, if it's the nature of an infinite source, whatever, however it's defined, if that's the essence, and I grew up in a church that said God is love, and I thought, most of these people don't seem to express that very well. They seem to have a lot of rules. I can't tip back in my chair. I got to wear a certain outfit. All these things sort of confounded me. But if love is love, it's absolute freedom, absolute freedom. No exceptions for anyone, anywhere, anytime. So anything we think is exceptional is a choice. Anything we think is distinct is a choice. Anything we think distinguishes us is a choice. Anything we think separates us or disconnects us is a choice. We cannot lose what we can't find because we have it. We cannot get to the place we're looking for, not because we can't get there, but because we're already there. We're thinking we're not there. We're thinking we need to be somewhere else. And by thinking we need to be somewhere else, we're thinking that we're not here. It's just a miscalculation and a mistaken identity in terms of who we think we are, but a mistaken approach to using thinking. Thinking is just something we do. It's a form of expression to help us navigate our spatial experience, space and time being intertwined. It's just an experience we're having. It's a body we have that has the sentient capacity to see and hear and smell and touch and also sense in a greater sense. The sixth sense is considered that greater sense. It's an awareness that obviously transcends the bodily activities that we do, that we have, and that we're feeding all the time is being fed to our brains. And it's not our senses that we're actually thinking about. It's what we're thinking about our senses. If I smell something that someone else loves and I don't like it, it's my thinking about it that's making that decision. I just have a preference. There's something in me. It may be genetic. It may be, who knows, whatever the traits are. I don't seem to struggle with my actual traits. I seem to struggle with the traits I make believe are who I am. So if I can start noticing that, start being the witness that I am to it, the observer of it that I am, in my thinking, because now I'm introducing that observation to my thinking as an observation rather than a challenge to everything I'm thinking. I just say, well, if I know better, I know better. I don't need to think about that to think of it in ways that are accurate. And all of a sudden, my thinking starts to relax a little bit because I'm not putting it on high alert, looking for anything that doesn't smack of or smell of the things I think should smell the way I want things to smell or see or hear. Just changes. It's always changing, but it changes in a direction of starting to eliminate the conflicts because there's no pressure in letting things be as they are. There's no conflict. There's no fight. There's no opposition because I haven't taken a position that I'm not admitting also includes all other positions. It's not, I don't take a position exclusive to everything else. I take a position inclusive of everything else. I can't dismiss reality and truth without wearing a burden that's impossible to wear. And thinking life is impossible is not true. Life is absolutely possible as it provides all possibilities. To think of it that way is to blame life rather than see the impossibility of my own thinking. And think of how close that thinking must be for me to imagine that life itself becomes impossible simply because I'm having an impossible thought. Think how close I need to be to that lens, and you start to realize how close we are and immediate we are to the experience we're creating and the thinking we're doing about the things we're seeing and hearing and smelling and touching and sensing.
And then I'm feeling guilty because I feel like a hypocrite because I just threw a thing of rum raisin ice cream or something in my cart. That's just terrible.
Well, I'll tell you, Anthony, for sure, you're guilty.
Exactly.
We don't feel guilty because we're innocent. So thinking of the experiences we're having, if you begin to actually listen to what your thinking is doing about what's happening, you'll start to see that the things we think are uncomfortable that we want to get away from are actually accurate assessments of the thinking we're doing, not who we are. If my thinking is bad and I feel bad, it's because I think I am my thinking that I feel bad. If I see my thinking as something I'm thinking and it's bad, I start realizing my thinking is bad. My thinking is wrong. Now I can see it as something I'm doing and as a result choosing, and now I can choose to continue doing that or not do that. There's the freedom from this idea that we're condemned to obsessively thinking about things that are wrong. It's just seeing it accurately. And the first thing we tend to witness is the effects. we don't always see the thinking that's going on, because my sense is there's a lot more going on in our thinking than we think there is. And so trying to isolate it means we're looking at one thing and not another, but trying to have it in total is starting to witness our experience, which is the totality of all the effects that we're experiencing. So if there's any wrong in it, I'm going to sense it. It doesn't have to be overwhelmingly wrong for me to begin to say somewhere in something I'm thinking isn't right, and live with it at peace, because I'm now having it as it is rather than as I think it is, and think it can't be anything other than what I think. And that the effects are really our perspective on what we're thinking. To think I need to get away from the effects and get over them is, again, thinking that the effects are the cause. And again, this reversal of thought, this idea that a lie can be true, when in fact a lie is only a lie as long as it's imagined to be true, because when a lie is a lie, it's true. It's the same thing with the effects. As soon as I think there's something I need to stop and get away from and can't admit and all that stuff, I think that they're the cause. It's not the case. The cause is the cause causing the effects. When I begin noticing it, I begin realizing I'm doing it, I'm choosing it, I'm responsible for it. And pretty soon that becomes easy, because you figure if it's happening, I'm responsible. That's it. I wouldn't be experiencing it if I wasn't responsible for it. I wouldn't even notice it if it truly had nothing to do with me. So if I notice it and think it doesn't, that's a conflict. That's just another way of thinking about it that isn't true. So hearing the effects and what they're saying, and saying this is literally accurate, not about me, but about what I'm thinking, begins to see that thinking creates the effects. And if we don't like the effects, we can always change the thinking. But if we're fighting the thinking to stop the thinking, we're thinking it's so true as though it has a life of its own, when in fact it doesn't. And we're not going to think we have a choice in it. So we're going to think it's happening to us. And the only thing we can do is suffer the effects. So the only thing we can do is feel better about it, which is exactly what drives us to drink and eat and overdo this, that, and the other thing. It's what compulsions are. They're all chances to get away from the obsessive thinking that can't be resolved, because it's constantly thinking that thinking about thinking is going to solve what's wrong. While in fact, it's the fixation of the thinking that's causing the wrong that we're trying to fix. It's loopy. And it starts getting funny when you start noticing that it's never been serious, and all that we've done is taken it seriously as being something that it isn't, which is what we called ourself. And if you think of the way people will often say, I, myself, personally, which is sort of identifying three different characteristics of a self, which is not only schizophrenic, but now multiple split personalities. So being able to see it humorously is being able to actually see it accurately, because it dispels the weight of the depression and the misery and the turmoil and the anxiety and the consequences that have seemed so interminable and so impossible to escape, and so natural because they've been so common, when in fact they're not natural at all. And the fact that they're common is just a reflection of our commitment to continuing to maintain them. But they are uncommon and unnatural and abnormal regardless, and unusual, as usual as they may seem. Any mas?
No, we covered a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
So it's contemplating and starting to notice whenever there's a conflict and you feel you need to push something aside, you're clearly reacting and defending what's going on. And it's a possibility. It's something you can do. Begin
The
to
sad part is
acknowledge
that it takes 3 hours to remember it. You know what I mean? It's like in another week, I need another 3 hours. It's not like I'm going, oh, I only need 10 minutes this week. It's like, okay,
Well,
I need 3 hours.
But you're already committing to the week, Anthony, rather than the moment. And where you are here is now. And where you will be, whatever you are during that week, is now. And if you begin to concede that, you'll begin to see that you actually do have great flexibility to even consider that something else could be done, to make believe that what you should be doing is the only thing you can be doing. Even that is an acknowledgement that there's a flexibility to what's happening that doesn't It doesn't make the thought intractable and impossible to stop. It begins to be seen as something that's absolutely flexible. But by paying attention to the wrong thing, we're starting to give it a sense of permanence that's a very convenient escape hatch for us to make believe we have nothing to do with it, when in fact that escape hatch condemns us to the thing we continue to do.
Right.
So you're seeing that. Now, listen, I wouldn't say that those are small things, Anthony, to actually witness things accurately. As you do that, you'll see that there is a bounty of insight and inspiration and intuitive knowledge that starts coming from that, because it's always been there. And now we're actually allowing the channel of our thinking to express it rather than be preoccupied with things trying to conclude it. And so you'll naturally start seeing this thing, as you have in many other ways. You've started to see things that were clear for you and start to see them consistently and start to wonder, why do I keep doing this? Well, my experience is the things we hold in what we call our self-conscious are things we don't think we're doing. So the things we think we're responsible for, and we keep in the dark and wonder why we feel dark and depressed. If the effects are occurring, they're connected to a cause. It doesn't matter where we think they are or where we think they're not. To begin to see that and concede that is to begin to just reckon with what's happening. And if you can be knowing you can be accepting of what's happening is beginning to concede that it's happening regardless of what you think. And it puts thinking on a much different par and scale, seeing that it doesn't have anything to do with the thinking. The effect is being created by the thinking, but thinking about it in ways that you want to deny it don't help it. It actually begins to compound it and consider it as something that's so real as it can, as can be opposed. I hope I got that out.
Yes, you did.
So play with it, and how you'll see it won't be according to my words, but if you consider it, it's because you have a knowing of it. And that knowing nature is what we share, not the words I use to describe it that I fail in accomplishing in all ways at all times. The words are never going to speak to this because they're all limited in definition, but they're all just aiming at something. They're referencing something. They're designed to give us a little prod and a little bit of encouragement to say, if I know it and I look, I will probably start seeing it accurately, or at least more accurately than I would be seeing it if I thought I wasn't doing it. And every time I looked, made believe I couldn't find anything other than more of that same thinking. It's just a witness. And it's really an awakened meditation and awakened contemplation, and beginning to observe that thinking is thinking. That's all. It's just thinking. It isn't concluding anything real and true. It's just thinking. Reality and truth is already concluded, and yet it's never ending. So it doesn't have any conclusive nature to it because it's always ever present. It's always new. It's always bountiful. It's always providing all possibilities for all that are possible in existence. It doesn't mean that it provides possibilities for that self we think we are, but it does provide the possibility for us to imagine all we are is what we think. And again, that shows how free we are. If we are so free to condemn ourselves, it's the choices we make and the thinking we do that condemn us, nothing else. It isn't a God. It isn't a hateful, spiteful, vengeful creature or creation or spirit. It's the thinking we're doing. That absolute nature is not in doubt, so it has no questions, and it has no conflict, and it doesn't live in the same kind of despair that we do. And for us to think of it in those terms is to see how quickly we would like something else to assume the things we're trying desperately to get rid of, rather than just begin to realize they're just a thought, nothing more. And to think they're real is to be insane in the thinking we're doing, to imagine we're the creators of reality and truth, when in fact we have been created in some way, somehow, from reality and truth. We're products of reality and truth, which is why we seem small in the universe, and yet we're intimately connected with it all and everything beyond it. And in an infinite conversation, the universe is tiny. It's a speck on a speck on a speck compared to what we're discussing.
And then maybe we could turn off the microphone for the last 5 minutes or something.
Why? What would you like everyone not to hear you say? You're welcome to say it, Anthony. You've been coming for quite some time. I've known you now for, I don't know, it seems like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, no, I just want to do it off the mic though.
Any other comments, thoughts?
It's really good.
No, good today.
My sense is the silence is often contemplation, and not knowing what to say is actually a leveling of awareness of things that are profound because they're well beyond the words we tend to use and the language we tend to speak. Starting to really notice that we have a language that we thought was foreign, that's a sense of knowing that we've never really put words to and really never discussed openly, and almost thought embarrassed to think of it as something that we actually could potentially be a part of, because so much of the human experience has been ground into this idea that all we are is what we think. And I wouldn't say everyone has always done that. I don't know. I haven't met everybody. But I would say it's been pretty consistent enough to be a presumption that seems to be pretty common for people to use their own righteous indignation to hurt and harm others in the name of what's right. And it seems to be going on today. And it's the world I live in and am a part of that it's happening in. Doesn't mean that it's all that's happening, but it certainly is evidence of how we're operating as a species on this planet. I don't think anybody, there may be some people out in space, but for the most part, everybody who's alive is on this planet or planning to come back soon. So if I can look at that and see that, I can see the impact I have in my own malfeasance and maladaptive and malnourished and maligned thinking, and start to just witness that and be a part of that. And the greater the connections I have with others in talking about it, the greater the sense I have that we all know much more than we think we know, and that we all represent something that's profound rather than something that's lost and needs to be found. So I love you guys. I'm glad to be here. And
Thanks, Jack.
everyone out there, thanks for listening. Thanks for joining. You're all welcome to send an email. You're welcome to participate in this discussion. And if anyone out there would like to talk on a one-on-one discussion or a 2-on-1, 3 of us together, you're welcome. Email and I'll get back to you and set it up.